William Morrison adjusted his red tunic for the final time, his weathered hands smoothing down the fabric that had become like a second skin over 3 decades. At 55 years old, he stood as straight and proud as the day he first put on the uniform of the Queen's Guard 30 years ago. Today would be his last day, protecting the royal family, his last morning walking the grounds of Buckingham Palace. As a serving member of the Guard, the morning air was crisp as William stepped out of the guard quarters, his polished boots clicking against the cobblestones in a rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. He had walked these same paths through rain, snow, blazing summer heat, and bitter winter mornings. Each step had been taken with purpose, each day spent in service to something greater than himself. As he made his way to his final posting outside the palace gates, William's mind wandered back to the young man he had been when he first arrived. Here, fresh out of military training, barely 25 years old, he had been nervous and excited about joining one of the most prestigious units in the British Army. Back then, everything seemed enormous and intimidating. The palace looked like a fortress. The other guards seemed impossibly experienced, and the weight of responsibility felt crushing. His first week had been a disaster. William had fainted during a particularly long ceremony in the summer heat, earning him teasing from the other guards that lasted for months. He had gotten lost trying to navigate the maze of corridors inside the palace, and he had accidentally called a senior officer by the wrong rank, causing embarrassment that made him want to quit and return home to his small village in Yorkshire, but something kept him going. Perhaps it was the pride in his father's eyes when William had written home about his posting. His father had been a coal miner his entire life, working in dangerous conditions for little pay. And the idea that his son would serve the Queen herself filled him with joy that William couldn't bear to disappoint. The other guards eventually warmed to William's determined spirit and honest nature. Sergeant Major Davies, a tough Welshman who had served for 20 years, took William under his wing and taught him not just the technical aspects of being a guard, but the deeper meaning of their service. Davies explained that being a Queen's Guard wasn't just about standing still and looking impressive for tourists. It was about being part of a tradition that stretched back centuries, about protecting something precious and irreplaceable. Over the years, William had witnessed moments of history that most people only read about in newspapers. He had been on duty during state visits from world leaders, royal weddings that captured global attention, and somber ceremonies that marked the passing of beloved figures. Each event had reinforced his understanding of why their work mattered, why the traditions they protected were worth preserving. The tourists who came to take pictures with the guards often saw them as living statues, amusing figures and funny hats who weren't allowed to move or speak. But William knew better. Behind the stoic facade, each guard was a highly trained soldier, constantly alert for any threat to the safety of the royal family. They were the first line of defense against anyone who might wish harm to the people they protected. William had made genuine friendships among the guards, relationships that had sustained him through the challenges of 3 decades of service. There was James, who had joined 5 years after William and had become his closest friend, sharing countless hours of conversation during quiet night shifts. There was Michael, the youngest member of their unit, who reminded William of himself. When he first arrived, eager and nervous and determined to prove himself worthy of the honor, the public rarely understood the sacrifices that came with being a Queen's Guard, the long hours, standing perfectly still, regardless of weather conditions, the missed family gatherings because duty came first, the constant awareness that they were representing not just themselves, but the entire tradition of royal protection. William had missed his daughter's first steps because he was on duty during a state dinner. He had spent Christmas mornings away from his family more often than he had spent them at home, but there had been compensations that made the sacrifices worthwhile. William had been privileged to witness moments of genuine kindness and grace from members of the royal family. He had seen them comfort grieving families, celebrate with communities, and work tirelessly on behalf of causes they believed in. These private moments of service and compassion were never reported in the newspapers, but they had shown William the true character of the people he protected. One memory that particularly stood out was from 10 years ago, when William's wife, Sarah, had been diagnosed with cancer. The news had devastated him, but he had tried to continue his duties without letting his personal concerns affect his performance. Somehow, word of his situation had reached one of the senior royals, and William had been quietly granted additional leave time to care for his wife during her treatment. No announcement was made, no publicity was sought. Just a quiet act of kindness from people who understood that their guards were human beings with families and concerns beyond their duty. Sarah had recovered fully, and she often reminded William that his service had brought unexpected blessings to their family. The steady income and excellent benefits had allowed them to provide their children with opportunities that would have been impossible on a civilian salary. Their daughter Emma was now a teacher, and their son Robert was serving in the Navy. Following in his father's tradition of service to the country, as William took his position for the final time, felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was sadness at leaving behind a life that had defined him for 30 years, but also pride in what he had accomplished and anticipation for the retirement years ahead. He and Sarah had plans to travel, to spend time with their grandchildren, to finally have the luxury of time together that his service had never allowed. The morning sun was rising over London, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard. William stood at attention, his back straight, his eyes alert, his mind filled with 3 decades of memories, and his heart full of gratitude for the privilege of serving something greater than himself. Today would end one chapter of his life, but the honor and pride of being a Queen's Guard would stay with him forever. The morning ceremony began, as it had thousands of times before. But William Morrison found himself noticing details he had taken for granted during his 3 decades of service. The sound of the changing of the guard, the precise movements that had become second nature. The tourists gathering to witness a tradition that stretched back through centuries of British history. As William stood at his post, his mind drifted to some of the most memorable moments of his career. There had been the royal wedding 15 years ago when millions of people around the world had watched as he and his fellow guards provided security for what many called the wedding of the century. The pressure had been enormous, with security, threats coming from multiple directions, but the day had gone perfectly. William remembered the joy on the faces of the royal couple and the pride he felt knowing he had played a small part in protecting their special day. Then there was the time when a disturbed individual had tried to climb the palace gates during a public event. William had been the first to spot the threat, and his quick action had prevented what could have been a dangerous situation. The incident had never made the newspapers, but William had received a personal commendation from his commanding officer, and the gratitude of the Royal Protection Team. Not all of his memories were dramatic. Some of the most meaningful moments had been quiet ones, like the morning when he had noticed a young girl in a wheelchair among the tourists watching the changing of the guard. She had been staring at him with such wonder and admiration that William had done something he rarely did while on duty. He had given her a small, barely perceptible nod. The smile that lit up her face had stayed with him for years. William thought about the evolution of his role over the decades. When he first joined the Guard, security concerns were different. Technology was simpler, and the world felt somehow smaller. Over the years, he had adapted to new threats, learned to use sophisticated communication equipment, and witnessed the gradual modernization of royal protection protocols. Through it all, the core mission had remained the same: protect the royal family and preserve the traditions that defined British identity. The relationships he had built with fellow guards were among the treasures of his career. These men came from all walks of life, from different regions of the United Kingdom, united by their commitment to service and their pride in wearing the uniform. They had supported each other through personal crises, had celebrated each other's achievements, formed bonds that would last long after their service ended. William remembered the young guards who had come and gone over the years, some staying for full careers like himself, others moving on to different paths after completing their initial commitments. He had served as an unofficial mentor to many of them, sharing the wisdom that Sergeant Major Davies had passed on to him decades earlier. The cycle of experience and guidance continued, ensuring that the traditions and standards of the Guard would be maintained for future generations. There had been moments of genuine danger during his service, times when his training and experience had been put to the ultimate test. A terrorist threat that had required the palace to be locked down for 3 days. A suspicious package that had turned out to be harmless, but had required hours of careful investigation. A mentally ill individual who had somehow gotten too close to a royal family member before being safely detained. Each incident had reinforced William's understanding of why his vigilance and professionalism mattered. The public often focused on the ceremonial aspects of the Queen's Guard, the colorful uniforms and precise movements that made for impressive photographs. But William knew that beneath the pageantry was a highly trained military unit capable of responding to serious threats with lethal force if necessary. The fact that such responses were rarely needed was a testament to the effectiveness of their presence and preparation. William had also witnessed the personal side of royal life in ways that few people ever could. He had seen the royal family dealing with loss, celebrating achievements, and navigating the complex demands of public service. These glimpses behind the public facade had only increased his respect for people who had chosen to dedicate their lives to serving others, often at great personal cost. One of the most touching memories William carried was from a Christmas morning 5 years ago. He had been on duty during a family gathering, and one of the younger royals had approached him with a small, wrapped gift. Inside was a handwritten note thanking him for his years of service and a small Christmas ornament that still hung on his tree at home. The gesture was simple but deeply meaningful, a reminder that his service was seen and appreciated. As the morning progressed and William continued his final watch, he reflected on how the role of the Queen's Guard had changed during his tenure. The world had become more connected, more immediate, more complex. Social media meant that every aspect of royal life was scrutinized and analyzed by millions of people around the globe. The Guards had adapted to these changes while maintaining the timeless traditions that made them recognizable symbols of British heritage. William thought about the young man who would take his place tomorrow. Probably nervous and excited just as he had been 30 years ago. This new guard would face different challenges, serve in a different era, but the core values would remain the same. Honor, duty, service, and an unwavering commitment to protecting something larger than oneself. The sun climbed higher over London, and William realized that his time was growing short. Soon, the ceremony would begin that would officially mark the end of his service. 30 years of dedication, sacrifice, and pride were about to conclude, but the memories and the honor of having served would remain with him forever. William Morrison was standing at his usual position when he noticed something unusual among the crowd of tourists gathering to watch the changing of the guard. An elderly woman in a worn coat was standing slightly apart from the others, staring directly at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She looked familiar, but William couldn't immediately place where he might have seen her before. The woman appeared to be in her 70s, with gray hair neatly arranged under a simple hat and eyes that held a mixture of sadness and determination. She clutched a small envelope in her gloved hands, and William could see that she was nervous about something. Unlike the other tourists who were taking pictures and chatting excitedly, she stood perfectly still, waiting for something. During a brief break in the ceremony, when William was able to step aside for a moment, the woman approached him cautiously. Her voice was soft but clear when she spoke, with an accent that suggested she came from somewhere in northern England. "Excuse me, sir," she said politely. "Are you William Morrison?" "I was told you would be here today." William was surprised too. Hear his name spoken by a stranger, especially during his final day of service. "Yes, ma'am. May I ask who's inquiring?" The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she maintained her composure as she introduced herself. "My name is Dorothy Richardson. My grandson was Peter Richardson, and I believe you might remember him." The name hit William like a physical blow. Peter Richardson had been a young man, barely 20 years old, who had tried to climb the palace gates 3 years ago during a mental health crisis. William had been the one to spot him first, and he had coordinated with other guards to safely detain Peter before he could hurt himself or anyone else. What made the incident memorable wasn't the security breach itself, which had been handled professionally and quietly. It was what William had learned afterward about Peter's situation. The young man had been struggling with severe depression, and had become obsessed with the idea that meeting a member of the royal family would somehow solve his problems. His attempt to climb the gates had been a desperate cry for help, rather than a genuine threat. William had gone beyond his official duties that day, staying with Peter until medical help arrived and making sure he was treated with compassion rather than simply processed as a security threat. He had even visited Peter in the hospital afterward, bringing him books and spending time talking with him about his struggles and hopes for the future. "Mrs. Richardson," William said gently, "I remember Peter very well. How's he doing?" The smile was radiant despite her tears. "That's why I'm here, Mr. Morrison. Peter is doing wonderfully. He's been stable for 2 years now. He's back in university studying social work. And he's engaged to a lovely girl named Susan. But most importantly, he's alive. And I believe that's partly because of your kindness to him that day." William felt a warmth spreading through his chest. "I'm so glad to hear that, Mrs. Richardson. Peter was a good young man who was going through a difficult time. I could see that he needed help, not punishment." Dorothy reached into her coat and pulled out a letter, holding it out to William with trembling hands. "Peter wanted to be here today to thank you in person, but he's taking exams at university. He wrote this letter for you, and he asked me to make sure you received it on your last day." William accepted the letter with reverence, understanding that this unexpected encounter was adding something special to what was already an emotional day. "Mrs. Richardson, you didn't need to make this journey just for this, but I did," Dorothy replied firmly. "See, after Peter's crisis, we learned about the compassion you showed him. The doctors told us that your kindness during those first crucial hours made a significant difference in his recovery. You treated him like a person who mattered, not like a problem to be solved." As William listened to Dorothy's words, he realized that this conversation was highlighting something important about his years of service. The public saw the Queen's Guard as symbols and protectors, but they rarely understood that the guards were also human beings who made individual choices about how to treat others with dignity and respect. Dorothy continued her story, explaining how Peter's encounter with William had become a turning point in his recovery. "Peter was at his lowest point that day, Mr. Morrison. He felt worthless, invisible, like his life didn't matter to anyone. But when you stayed with him and talked to him like he was important, it reminded him that people could still care about him." William opened the letter carefully, conscious that dozens of tourists were watching his every move. Peter's handwriting was clear and thoughtful, expressing gratitude not just for William's professional response to his crisis, but for the humanity he had shown during a moment when Peter felt completely alone. The letter described Peter's journey back to mental health, his return to education, and his plans for a career helping other young people who were struggling with similar challenges. Peter wrote that William's example had shown him how much difference one person's kindness could make, and that he wanted to pass that lesson on to others who needed help. "Peter also wanted me to tell you," Dorothy said, "that he's getting married next month, and he would be honored if you could attend the ceremony. He says you're part of the reason he's alive to have a wedding." William felt tears welling up in his eyes, something that hadn't happened during his years of maintaining perfect composure while on duty. "Mrs. Richardson, I would be deeply honored to attend Peter's wedding. Please tell him that meeting him was one of the privileges of my service." As Dorothy prepared to leave, she paused and looked directly at William. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that what you did for Peter wasn't just about following your training or doing your job. You chose to see a hurting young man instead of just a security problem. That choice saved my grandson's life." After Dorothy had disappeared back into the crowd, William stood holding Peter's letter. Overwhelmed by the realization that his years of service had touched individual lives in ways he had never fully understood, he had always focused on the larger mission of protecting the royal family and preserving British traditions. But now he understood that his service had also been about smaller, more personal moments of human connection. The letter in his hands represented something precious, proof that the compassion and dignity he had tried to bring to his role had made a real difference in someone's life. As William prepared for the final hours of his career, he realized that this unexpected gift from Dorothy and Peter had given his retirement a meaning and purpose he hadn't anticipated. The afternoon brought an unexpected summons that would make William Morrison's final day even more memorable than he had imagined possible. Captain Edwards, the commanding officer of the Queen's Guard, approached William during the lunch break with news that left him stunned and deeply moved. "Morrison," Captain Edwards said with a slight smile, "you're requested in the blue drawing room at 3 o'clock. There's someone who wants to speak with you before you finish your service." William had been inside the palace many times during his career, but always in an official capacity, usually for briefings or special security arrangements. As he made his way through the corridors he knew so well, William wondered who could possibly want to see him on his final day. The blue drawing room was one of the most beautiful spaces in the palace. Decorated with priceless artwork and furniture that had witnessed centuries of British history, William had guarded this room during countless official functions. But he had never actually been inside it as anything other than security personnel. When William entered the room, he was shocked to see a senior member of the royal family waiting. For him, someone he had protected and observed from a respectful distance for many years. The royal family member was dressed casually, sitting in one of the elegant chairs with a warm, genuine smile that immediately put William at ease. "Sergeant Morrison," the royal said, rising to shake William's hand. "Please sit down. I wanted to have a chance to speak with you personally before your retirement." William was overwhelmed by the honor of this private audience. "Your Royal Highness, this is completely unexpected. I'm not sure what to say." "Say nothing for now. Just listen," came the gentle reply. "I've been made aware that today marks the end of 30 years of faithful service, and I wanted to personally express the gratitude of my family for your dedication and professionalism." The conversation that followed was unlike anything William had experienced during his career, instead of the formal, distant interactions he was accustomed to. This was a genuine conversation between two people who had shared the same spaces for many years, even if from different perspectives. "Sergeant Morrison, you might be surprised to learn how much we notice about the people who protect us. Your kindness, your attention to duty, your respect for others, these qualities haven't gone unobserved. We've heard about your compassion toward visitors, your mentoring of younger guards, and your unwavering commitment to serving with honor." William felt deeply moved by these words, but he was even more surprised by what came next. The royal family member reached for a small wrapped package on the nearby table and presented it to William with obvious pleasure. "This is a small token of our appreciation, something I hope you'll treasure during your retirement years." Inside the package was a beautiful pocket watch, clearly antique and obviously valuable. But what made it truly special was the engraving. On the back, "For William Morrison. In recognition of 30 years of faithful service to the crown, with gratitude and respect." "Your Royal Highness," William said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for this honor. Serving your family has been the greatest privilege of my life. Actually, Sergeant Morrison, there's something else I wanted to discuss with you. We've been following your story, and we're aware of the young man you helped a few years ago, Peter Richardson. We understand that your compassion during his crisis played a significant role in his recovery." William was amazed that this act of kindness had been noticed at such high levels. "I simply did what seemed right, Your Royal Highness. Peter was clearly suffering, and he needed help rather than punishment." "Exactly," the royal replied with approval. "And that's precisely the kind of judgment and humanity we value in the people who serve us. But there's something you might not know about Peter's story." William listened with growing amazement as he learned that Peter's recovery and return to education had come to the attention of one of the royal charities focused on mental health support for young people. Peter had actually been invited to share his story at several events, helping to raise awareness about mental health issues and the importance of compassionate intervention during crisis situations. "Peter has specifically mentioned your role in his recovery during these presentations," the royal family member explained. "His story has helped other young people understand that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. In a very real way, your kindness to one troubled young man has had a ripple effect that has helped dozens of others." William was overwhelmed by this revelation. He had known that his interaction with Peter had been meaningful, but he had never imagined that it would become part of a larger effort to help other young people facing similar struggles. "Your Royal Highness, I had no idea that Peter was involved in such important work." "The best acts of service often have consequences we never see," came the wise reply. "Your 30 years of faithful duty, your mentoring of younger guards, your compassion toward visitors and staff, all of these actions have created positive effects that extend far beyond what you might realize." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering William's career, his family, and his plans for retirement. What struck William most was the genuine interest and warmth shown by someone he had protected but never really known as a person. The royal family member asked about his wife's health, his children's careers, and his hopes for the future with the kind of personal concern usually reserved for close friends. As their meeting drew to a close, William was presented with one final surprise. "Sergeant Morrison, we understand that you've been invited to a wedding next month, Peter Richardson's wedding. We wanted you to know that we've arranged for you and your wife to attend as our representatives, with our compliments and best wishes for the happy couple." William could barely speak as he processed this extraordinary gesture. Not only was he being honored for his service, but his act of compassion toward a troubled young man was being recognized and celebrated at the highest levels of the institution he had served. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," William managed to say. "This kindness means more to me than I can express." As William left the blue drawing room, he carried with him not just a beautiful pocket watch and the memory of an incredible conversation, but a deep understanding of how his years of service had created connections and meaning that would last long after he hung up his uniform for the final time. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the palace courtyard, Tawana Morrison prepared for the ceremony that would formally mark the end but his 30-year career as a Queen's Guard. The entire guard unit had assembled in the main courtyard, their red tunics and black bearskin hats creating the familiar sight that had become synonymous with British tradition and royal protection. Captain Edwards stood before the assembled guards, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. As he began the retirement ceremony, "Today we honor Sergeant William Morrison, who has served with distinction for 30 years. His dedication, professionalism, and unwavering commitment to duty have exemplified the finest traditions of the Queen's Guard." William stood at attention as his service record was read aloud, a chronicle of 3 decades spent in protection of the royal family. The list of ceremonies he had participated in, the state visits he had helped secure, and the countless hours he had spent at his post painted a picture of a life dedicated to something greater than personal ambition or comfort. As Captain Edwards spoke, William could see his fellow guards listening with respect and appreciation. These men understood better than anyone the sacrifices and commitment that 30 years of service represented. They knew the physical demands of standing motionless for hours in all weather conditions, the mental discipline required to maintain constant alertness, and the personal costs of putting duty before family obligations. The formal presentation of his retirement certificate was accompanied by words of praise that meant more to William than any monetary reward could have. "Sergeant Morrison has served as an example to younger guards, a mentor to those seeking guidance, and a steadfast protector of the values we hold dear. His service has been marked not just by professional excellence, but by the compassion and humanity he has brought to every aspect of his duties." Among the crowd of spectators, William spotted his wife Sarah, their children Emma and Robert, and their grandchildren who had come to witness this important moment. Sarah's eyes were bright with tears of pride, and William could see how moved she was by the formal recognition of his service. Their children stood tall with obvious pride in their father's achievements, and the grandchildren watched with wide-eyed fascination at seeing their grandfather honored in such an impressive ceremony. But the most meaningful moment came when Captain Edwards called forward several of the younger guards to speak about William's influence on their careers. Michael, the youngest member of their unit, stepped forward first with obvious nervousness, but clear determination to express his gratitude. "Sergeant Morrison taught me that being a Queen's Guard isn't just about following orders or looking impressive. For photographs," Michael said, his voice carrying across the courtyard, "he showed me that our real job is to serve with honor, to treat everyone with respect, to remember that we're protecting something precious that belongs to all British people. James, William's closest friend among the guards, spoke next. About the countless hours William had spent helping other guards navigate personal challenges, professional difficulties, and the unique pressures of their role. William never considered himself off-duty when it came to looking after his fellow guards. He was always available with advice, support, or just a listening ear when someone needed it. Several other guards shared similar stories, creating a picture of William as not just a competent soldier, but as a leader who had made the entire unit stronger through his example and guidance. William listened with growing emotion as he realized that his efforts to mentor and support his colleagues had been noticed and appreciated far more than he had understood. The formal ceremony concluded with the presentation of William's final orders, officially releasing him from active duty after 30 years of service, as he accepted the document that marked the end of his career. William felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in what he had accomplished, sadness at leaving behind a life that had defined him, and gratitude for the honor of having served. But the surprises weren't over yet. As the official ceremony ended and the other guards began to disperse, Captain Edwards approached William with one final announcement. "Morrison, there's one more thing. The royal family has requested that you remain available for special occasions. State funerals, major ceremonies, royal weddings. If you're willing, you'll be called upon to serve as an honorary guard during these significant events." This offer was completely unexpected, and it meant that William's connection to the Queen's Guard wouldn't end completely with his retirement. He would still be part of the tradition he had served so faithfully, still contributing to the protection. In honor of the royal family during the most important moments of national celebration or mourning, "Captain Edwards," William replied with deep emotion, "I would be honored to continue serving in any capacity the royal family deems appropriate." As the afternoon ceremony concluded, William was surrounded by well-wishers, fellow guards, palace staff, and family members who wanted to congratulate him on his service and wish him well in retirement. The conversations were warm and heartfelt, filled with memories shared and gratitude expressed. But perhaps the most touching moment came when several tourists approached William to thank him for his service. Word had somehow spread among the crowd that this was his final day, and people from around the world wanted to express their appreciation for his dedication. One elderly American couple thanked him for representing the best of British tradition, while a young family from Australia asked to take a photograph with him as a memory of their visit to London. As the day drew toward evening, William realized that his retirement ceremony had become something much larger than a simple end to his career. It had become a celebration of service itself, a recognition of the value of dedication, compassion, and commitment to something greater than oneself. Standing in the palace's courtyard for the final time as an active member of the Queen's Guard, William felt overwhelmed by gratitude for the life he had been privileged to live. 30 years of service had given him purpose, friendship, honor, and the knowledge that his work had mattered in ways both large and small. Tomorrow he would wake up as a civilian for the first time in 3 decades, but the pride and honor of having served would remain with him forever. 1 month after his retirement, William Morrison stood in a small church in Yorkshire, wearing his best civilian suit, but carrying himself with the same proud bearing that had defined his years as a Queen's Guard. He was attending Peter Richardson's wedding, representing the royal family as promised. But more importantly, he was there as someone who had played a crucial role in making this happy day possible. Peter looked transformed from the troubled young man William had encountered 3 years ago during his mental health crisis. He stood at the altar with confidence and joy, his face glowing as he waited for his bride Susan to walk down the aisle. The church was filled with family and friends who had supported Peter through his recovery, and William felt honored to be included among them during the reception. Peter made a point of introducing William to everyone as the man who helped save my life. The story of their encounter had become part of Peter's recovery narrative, a reminder of how compassion from a stranger during a dark moment had helped him find his way back to hope and purpose. "Mr. Morrison," Peter said during a quiet moment, "between them, I want you to know that your kindness didn't just help me that day. It taught me something about how to treat other people who are struggling. In my social work studies, I think about your example all the time." William was deeply moved by this revelation. "Peter, you've accomplished something remarkable by turning your crisis into a desire to help others. Your recovery has been your own achievement. But it started with you choosing to see me as a person worth caring about," Peter replied. "Something I'll never forget, and it's something I try to pass on to everyone I work with now." The wedding celebration was joyful and heartwarming, but it also marked an important transition in William's retirement. He realized that his post-service life was going to be shaped by the relationships and connections he had formed during his career, not just the memories of ceremonial duties and security protocols. Over the following weeks, William settled into the rhythm of civilian life. He and Sarah took the trip to Scotland they had been planning for years, visiting places they had only dreamed about when his duties kept him tied to London. They spent time with their grandchildren, sharing stories and experiences that had been impossible during the demanding years of active service. But William found that complete retirement wasn't entirely satisfying. He missed the sense of purpose that had driven him for 30 years, the feeling that his work mattered and contributed to something important. Sarah noticed his restlessness and encouraged him to find new ways to serve his community. The solution came through an unexpected phone call from Dorothy Richardson, Peter's grandmother. She had been volunteering with a local veterans support organization and thought William might be interested in getting involved. The organization helped former military personnel adjust to civilian life, providing counseling, job placement assistance, and social support for people struggling with the transition from service to retirement. William's first visit to the Veterans Center opened his eyes to challenges he hadn't fully understood. Many former servicemen and women were struggling with depression, financial difficulties, and a loss of identity after leaving the military. Some had physical injuries from their service, while others carried emotional scars that weren't immediately visible. What struck William most was how many of these veterans felt forgotten and undervalued after years of dedicated service. They had given their best years to protecting their country, but civilian society often didn't understand or appreciate the sacrifices they had made. William recognized something of himself in their struggles, even though his transition to retirement had been much smoother than theirs. Drawing on his experience mentoring younger guards, William began volunteering as a counselor and advocate for veterans who were having difficulty adjusting to civilian life. His military bearing and obvious pride in his service gave him instant credibility with people who had served in different branches of the armed forces. William's approach was simple but effective. He listened to their stories without judgment, shared his own experiences of service and transition, and helped them understand that their military skills and values could be adapted to civilian careers and community service. His years of standing guard had taught him patience, and his experience with Peter Richardson had shown him the power of treating people with dignity during their most vulnerable moments. One of the veterans William worked with was a former Royal Navy sailor named Tom who had been struggling with alcohol problems since leaving the service 2 years earlier. Tom felt lost without the structure and purpose that military life had provided, and he was bitter about what he saw as society's indifference to veterans' problems. William spent hours talking with Tom about finding new sources of purpose and meaning in civilian life. He shared his own initial struggles with retirement, his feelings of restlessness, and how volunteering had given him a new sense of mission. Gradually, Tom began to respond to William's patient guidance and genuine concern. "The thing about military service," William explained to Tom during one of their conversations, "is that it teaches us to be part of something bigger than ourselves. The challenge in civilian life is finding new ways to serve that same ideal." Within 6 months, Tom had stopped drinking, found steady employment, and begun volunteering at a homeless shelter. He credited William's mentoring with helping him understand that his military values of service and dedication could be channeled into civilian pursuits that were just as meaningful as his naval career had been. William's work at the Veterans Center gradually expanded beyond individual counseling. He began organizing group sessions where former servicemen and women could share their experiences and support each other. He developed workshops on translating military skills into civilian job qualifications, and he created social events that helped isolated veterans build new community connections. The success of William's programs attracted attention from other veterans organizations across London. Soon, he was being invited to speak at conferences, share his methods with other counselors, and serve on committees dedicated to improving veteran services. His reputation as someone who understood both the challenges of military service and the difficulties of civilian transition made him a sought-after advisor and advocate. 2 years after his retirement from the Queen's Guard, William received another unexpected phone call. This time it was from the palace, inviting him to serve on a new royal commission focused on veterans affairs. The commission was being established to study ways the royal family and government could better support former military personnel. And William's experience working with struggling veterans made him an ideal member. The irony wasn't lost on William that his retirement from royal service had led him to a new form of service to the crown, this time focused on helping the very people who had served alongside him in protecting British interests around the world. His work with individual veterans had evolved into an opportunity to influence policy and create systemic changes that could help thousands of former servicemen and women. As William prepared for his first commission meeting, he reflected on the unexpected path his life had taken since leaving the Queen's Guard. He had expected retirement to be a time of rest and relaxation, but instead it had become a new chapter of service and purpose. The skills and values that had made him an effective guard, patience, compassion, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to serving others, had found new expression in his work with veterans. Standing in his study, watch that had been presented to him on his final day of service, William understood that his 30 years as a Queen's Guard had been preparation for this next phase of his life. The honor and discipline of royal service had given him the foundation to make a difference in the lives of people who needed guidance and support. His watch had ended at Buckingham Palace, but his service to others would continue for as long as he was able to make a difference in someone's life.